Perhaps you are trying to correct something which cannot be corrected.
It is personal!
That's a bell you don't unring.
Yep. I don't deserve to die, but they don't either.
I decide what he deserves.
What have I gotten myself involved with here?
The righteous have no reason to fear.
Sometimes the good guys win.
Hello everyone. Throughout this series of videos, which you don't have to watch in order, you don't have to watch it at all, but you also don't have to watch it in order, but we've talked a bit here and there about how Better Call Saul is centered around themes of revenge. Today we're going to revisit this, and let's start with some insightful comments on the subject from friend of the channel, Gustavo Fring.
Revenge.
Very well said, Gus. Anyway, we talked in the most recent video about how very early on, Jimmy takes revenge on Howard and HHM after Chuck passes along the message that Jimmy shouldn't use his own last name for his business. He takes revenge, of course, with the billboard, but this is closer to harmless trolling than anything serious. Almost exactly 2 years later, we see him willing to raise the stakes a lot more, taking revenge on Howard in big ways when he's offended at being offered a job, which we also discussed in the previous video. We've talked about a lot. In between, he took all different kinds of revenge. He threatened and essentially kidnapped those young guys after they beat him up his first night selling cell phones. He reported negative information to Chuck's liability insurance carrier after Chuck got Jimmy's law license suspended. And we're still just talking about Jimmy here, but it must be mentioned, even the legendary Chicago sunroof was revenge. So revenge is a big part of the story, and some revenge works out better than other revenge, I guess you could say. His slip and fall at the guitar store was a form of revenge. It was his escalation after the store owners wronged him by jumping ship after one commercial instead of going through with the whole package as they had agreed to do. Of course, that was not very nice of them, and it's not Jimmy's fault they did that. But a question we will get into in this video is when revenge is good and when it's just justified. When you're harmed, taking revenge is one option, but of course it isn't the only one. Like in this case with the guitar store, was the money and the signed guitar worth lying to Kim and not telling her what he did? You know, he was trying to keep the office to keep them closer together, but he's lying to her in the process. Not to mention whatever back issue he aggravated. But what else was he supposed to do with the guitar store? I mean, leave them a review on Yelp? The show repeatedly asked the question, what way of fighting back against injustice is most productive? It has to be admitted that many people in Jimmy's position would have found themselves, instead of slipping and falling, reflecting on what had led them to that unfortunate point. He was on the hook for over $6,000 and at serious risk of losing the expensive office with Kim he had prioritized so much, all because he lost his law license and couldn't legally use the airtime he bought with the TV station for the commercials for his legal services. Is it safe to say that Jimmy getting his law license suspended was Chuck's revenge for Jimmy switching the numbers on the Mesa Verde documents? Or did Chuck have enough non-revenge motivation there for his effort to be justified anyway? Was Jimmy switching the numbers revenge for Chuck braving the electromagnetic waves and going into the office just to convince Mesa Verde not to leave HHM with Kim when she suddenly went into private practice? Or did Jimmy have enough non-revenge motivation there for his effort to be justified anyway? Was Chuck convincing Mesa Verde itself revenge for Kim suddenly leaving and taking their big new client with her? Or revenge for her trusting and believing in Jimmy, or revenge against Jimmy in general? Was this a whole bunch of sequential revenge, or is it more complicated? And if it was all revenge, was it all justified? And if it was all justified, was it good? It was certainly good television, I can tell you that. It was the best television. In this video, we're going to be looking at when revenge seems right and satisfying and when it doesn't. By the way, about that last step in the HHM versus Kim battle over Mesa Verde, I went on a long tangent about it and a whole lot of other stuff, and that's all in a bonus video live now for Patreon supporters and YouTube members, so if you're interested in all the extra thoughts and ideas that were too irrelevant to make it into this video, throw $1 or $2 to the channel and check out all these bonus ideas. It'll be a nice icing on the cake thing because this video here today is the 8th and last one in our Better Call Saul series, for a while at least. But we've only just barely begun. To move away from our protagonist for a second, in an infamous scene, Gus gives a probably unconscious Hector a legendary monologue, a slow and meaningful story that, as far as I can remember, is the only insight in the whole series into Fring's childhood. He tells Hector, or really he recounts to himself in Hector's presence, a story of his life, describing how he grew up in poverty and how his family had a lucuma tree that he became fixated on at age 7. Through his abiding love and attention, the tree finally bore fruit for the first time, and then one day a cute animal called a coati came by and ate all the fruit. Little Gus got his revenge by catching it in a snare, and when it finally tore itself free, Gus hid for hours into the night, waiting for it to come out.
Finally, it came out. It knew I was there, but it was hungry.
Gus's monologue to Hector continues with him explaining that he let the coati live on for a long while in pain.
I kept it.
Good luck sleeping tonight, everyone. Anyway, this is a big moment for Better Call Saul because it recontextualizes the other characters' forms of revenge, making us ask, for example, why was Jimmy's Mesa Verde revenge less sadistic than this? Because Chuck did more to consciously harm him and Kim than the innocent hungry coati did to little Gus? Because little Gus relished in an animal's pain instead of just neglecting it like Jimmy did with the pain he would cause Chuck? Sure, these factors affect how we feel about the flavor of revenge, but it makes you wonder how exactly we draw these lines in our moral calculations about fighting fire with fire, and what principles we might need if we want to even be able to draw lines at all. Interestingly, this episode with Gus's monologue to Hector is titled Piñata because it's the same one where Jimmy incapacitates and strings up those young guys who beat him up on the street his first night selling phones. Of course, this is not a coincidence, and the show is asking us to let our minds consider these two revenges side by side. Jimmy's revenge was more justified because those guys attacked him and he didn't hurt them physically, but I also found myself thinking a lot about why we even consider something like this an act of revenge when Jimmy wouldn't have done it just to get back at them. He did it to be able to sell phones on the street, but we wouldn't find it justified for that reason alone. It's only justified as an act of revenge. So the revenge motive isn't enough on its own to motivate Jimmy to do this, but the practical motive isn't enough on its own to justify his actions to the viewers. What do we make of this? Better Call Saul is chock full of case studies of revenge. For example, we talked extensively in part 2 about Mike's decision to kill the policeman who murdered his son. I get a lot of comments on that video from people telling me I'm wrong and Mike was totally justified in killing those cops, but the funny thing is I never said he wasn't. I never said Mike was wrong to kill the cops, and I specifically say I don't know if he should even feel any guilt about it. I waffle a bit in the video about the word deserve, and I stand by that waffling because the word is vague, but I also specifically say that, quote, murderer's right to life is not clearly superior to the right of a victim's relatives to avenge their death. Some commenters genuinely disagreed with things I said, like my views on the death penalty, and that's obviously fine, but it was interesting how a lot of people really just bristled at the fact that I was describing the situation as ethically complex and nuanced. For instance, why did I consider what Mike's son Matt would have wanted? He was dead. Another example was the comment that when I have kids, I'll understand just how cut and dry this is. This despite me saying explicitly, quote, if someone killed a family member of mine, I'm not sure what I would do. Some people don't jive with that uncertainty. They say, no, you should know what you will do. This is because there are people who I think view revenge as not just acceptable, but maybe even compulsory. There are people who have revenge as an integral part of their code of ethics. They hear the expression, an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind, and they shrug and say, well, I better get some eye patches. The closest I come in that video to criticizing Mike's actions with the cops is when I say that, quote, I don't think revenge murder is healthy and I don't think it's the only form of closure or the best form of closure. I was sort of being slightly tongue-in-cheek, but I did mean that in a serious way, and I know some people might hear that as me condemning Mike's actions, but that's just a misunderstanding. I'm saying it's not healthy and it's not ideal, but I'm not saying it's unjustified or wrong. A lot of things are not healthy and not ideal, but I still think people should have the right to do them. I also do think there's an argument for the the idea that Mike killing these guys was a step towards his own closure about what happened, but my feeling is still that it's unhealthy to need revenge for closure, especially because there are many situations in life where revenge is not possible. But in this case, it was. I think we can all agree that Mike had the right to kill those two guys. The more important and relevant question, in my opinion, is whether I want to live in a world where people in Mike's position kill people in those cops' position. Because for everyone in Mike's position of committing a clean-cut, justified vigilante execution, there are others who do so too, but they were wronged in a less severe way, or they're less certain of who the perpetrator is, or they kill in revenge in an unnecessarily cruel way, or there are just a ton of unintended consequences, something Better Call Saul definitely shows us in some other circumstances, and maybe this one as well. So I'm not asking whether Mike was justified, I'm asking whether it was a good decision. Saying Mike's actions were good is saying they were not only justified, but also that they led to good things, that they were a net positive in their consequences. If you think Mike killing the cops was good, do you think 7-year-old Gus torturing an animal was good? Probably not, I assume/hope. But then let me ask, if you thought it was good for Mike to kill those cops, what if he tortured them instead? Would that be good? What if he tortured them for just an hour? Is that okay because it's his revenge? What if he tortured them for months? I mean, the pain they caused Mike and his family is immeasurable, right? So at what point could we ever say that Mike causing them pain was excessive? When do we start expecting a harmed person like Mike to start being merciful or caring about the hypothetical social contract again? Of course, any of us who are even slightly mature understand that being victimized is not a blank check to inflict harm, but what Better Call Saul does so well is present us with countless examples of victims inflicting harm, and we're asked to reflect on why different ones feel so different. Let's pause and consider some real-life situation of revenge I might identify with. As I said in part 2, even if I wouldn't kill in revenge, that's not necessarily because it's morally wrong, but instead it's just not my style. I have a sort of non-killing people aesthetic. It's sort of my brand. But let's think of a different example. Let's say someone targeted me, painted a threatening message on my door, and threw rocks through my windows. Now, if you've seen the side channel about rock stacking, you know I love rocks, but I probably would be pretty angry if all my windows were smashed and I felt targeted. Now, let's say somehow I found out who did it, they didn't know I knew, and I knew where they lived or worked or whatever. Would I want to retaliate? Even if I was sure I could threaten or harm them or their property without getting caught, would I want to do it? I'm not asking if it's justified, of course it is. I'm just asking whether it's wise. And I'm not implying the answer is no, I'm just not sure that it's yes. How would my retaliation affect others in my community? Would it make others safer or more at risk? Shouldn't that matter? Surely being a victim myself doesn't entitle me to ignore other people around me as I exact my revenge. And also, would my retaliation even make my own life better, or would it make it worse? That certainly matters too. I pointed out in part 2 that Mike's revenge put Stacy in a difficult position as well as himself. He made Stacy lie to the cops, which is always fun, but it can get you in trouble. One thing I would be fascinated to know is whether Stacy appreciated what Mike did. It's easy to imagine she would. Still, it's not certain, and it's not certain at all that Matt would have wanted it. I feel justified even guessing from what we know about him that Matt would never in a million years have wanted Mike to kill Hoffman and Fensky. Look at that cute little guy, I mean, come on. And if the hypothetical perspective of the victim doesn't matter, it's certainly a more selfish type of revenge, no? Does this affect how morally justified the revenge is, or is it already just so well beyond the threshold of justifiability that it doesn't even matter if it's a little selfish? Some of the complexity of revenge has to do with what I think of as the dual nature of causation with human behavior, where we do things from certain causes and also for certain causes. Our actions are propelled from past events as much as they're attempting to propel towards certain future events. I take out the trash both because it's full and because I don't want it to attract bugs, you know? I tell someone I love them both because of the way they make me feel as well as because I want them to know I love them. Speaking of which, the one time we see Jimmy say I love you to Kim, it's much more for a cause than from a cause, since she's breaking up with him at that point and he's, I guess, trying to, make that not happen.
I love you.
But anyway, when we ask why someone did something, we might be asking what caused it from the past, or we might be asking what its goal was in the future. This is what I mean by the dual nature of causation. It's just an interesting fact of language and, I guess, of life. I think it might say something meaningful about how we understand our reality. It might kind of reveal how we give ourselves wiggle room to sometimes justify an action one way and sometimes justify it the other way. If an action is justified by past events, who cares what it causes? If an action is justified by what it causes, who cares what the action really was and what led to it anyway? And I think that's how we trick ourselves sometimes. When we take this approach to Better Call Saul, we can see that Mike killed those cops because of what they did, but I can't think of what he was trying to cause in the future except for them to die. He was causing the world to be rid of these two morally bankrupt cops, but come on, are we really going to sit around pretending this was anything approaching a motivation for Mike? To this point, season 1 showed us how when he's talking with his old cop friend from Philadelphia, his friend says,
"There's a lot of people we both know and think that Fensky got what was coming to him. Hoffman, too."
When I watch Mike give this half-hearted, vague nod, I don't see a man who really believes in the justice of what he did. Actually, we don't have to try to read his body language if we consider the simple fact that his cop friend even says this to Mike at all, says anything about Mike's actions being justified. That speaks directly to the vibe that Mike was giving off, which was, wow, I'm kind of drained from having to go through all this with Stacy and with the younger cop. I got myself into a bit of a mess. So that's why with this half-hearted nod, I see a man who knows he had the right to do what he did, but it was, for lack of a better analogy, similar to the Kwati taking the Lacuma fruit from 7-year-old Gus. It was natural and right for him to do what he wanted, and we can't take that away. Still, there are people who miss those horrible cops, and it's hard to admit, but it's true. And Mike inflicted suffering on them that they did not deserve because they didn't do anything wrong. This doesn't make his actions unjustified, just complicated. What he did was justice in the same way that there's a sun in the sky. It depends on your perspective. Over the arc of the show's 6 seasons, Mike starts to let himself believe that revenge truly is justice, not just justified. He used to be the type of person not to lie to himself about doing something, not having to tell himself it was good or noble. Sure, those cops deserved it, but I bet you they had kids who didn't deserve it and who suffered from lack of even a shitty parent like these men. The suffering of these kids doesn't balance out the suffering of Kaylee. I'm sorry to report, we don't live in a video game. The suffering is separate and valid in both cases. My impression of early Mike is that he knew this and would never have tried to justify making the family members of the cops suffer. My impression is he would have shrugged and said, "That's unfortunate. I guess their dad shouldn't have murdered my son." What he did stood alone and was justified to himself regardless of such externalities and regardless of whether it would qualify as actual justice. He knew he wasn't trying to balance a global moral checkbook. He was doing what he wanted because it fit his code of values. But the Mike we see in season 6 is very different, shown most notably when after Nacho dies, Mike's empathy leads him to try to give closure to Manuel, Nacho's father. Mike is undoubtedly trying to do a good thing here, but I waver on whether it was right at all. At the end of the day, Mike didn't tell Manuel anything he couldn't have guessed, and while Nacho would have wanted Mike to protect his dad's safety, I don't have any memory of him saying, "Please go talk to my dad." Nacho had his last conversation with his dad over the phone, and after thinking this all through, it starts to feel like Mike's good intentions in talking to Manuel were a bit more self-serving than we might have assumed at first. He at least has pretty good intentions, and things seem like they might be going okay until after vaguely explaining that Nacho got wrapped up with some bad people, Mike takes it a step further and tries to reassure Manuel that he doesn't need to worry about the Salamancas anymore.
The day is coming. There'll be justice.
This reassurance is completely bizarre, since Manuel didn't ask about the Salamancas and doesn't seem to require this information at all. But it's especially bizarre to hear the word justice come out of Mike's mouth, and I was really shocked the first time I saw this scene. Not that it's out of character, but it shows just how much he's lost his ability to be honest with himself. There's a wild moment here where Manuel reacts sort of in a confused way to Mike saying this about justice, so Mike tries to translate the word justice into Spanish, as if the discrepancy here is a language-based one. This is brilliant writing, first of all, but it's also obviously not the case that that's what the discrepancy is about, and it shows how wrapped up Mike is in his own narrative about what's going on, so he doesn't even realize at first that Manuel is taking issue with the word, not confused about it. He clarifies for Mike and the audience.
It's not justice. What you talk of is revenge.
It doesn't get much clearer than that, and I wonder if this is quite similar to what Mike's son Matt would say to him about his decision to kill Hoffman and Fenske. This conversation with Manuel is 2+ years later from his conversation with the Philly cops, and by this point Mike has opened up his mind so fully to the lifestyle he's living that he's taking it upon himself to carry out revenge for other people's family members being killed. What a nice guy. No, the truth is the same as it was before. He can't help himself. But whereas before he couldn't help himself because he was so justifiably upset about his son being killed, in season 6 he can't help himself because he has almost no independent life outside of his work with Gus. He might do things here and there Gus doesn't know about, sure, but he has locked himself in the situation he's in. I don't think he can give 2 weeks notice at this point. But when I say Mike's changed, still, people are pretty complicated and can change in a more fluid way than the linear way we often might think of. Hey, we're finally answering that first video's title, can people change? I guess the answer was yes all along. I'm gonna miss this series. Mike's more self-aware side seems to poke through again in his blank, defeated expression after Manuel says,
Ustedes son el cartel y su justicia. Todos son iguales.
Even though he said that in Spanish, Mike gets the point, since it's right after the comment that this isn't justice, it's revenge, and also Manuel walks away, which obviously says a lot. Mike's disappointment at the end of the scene reveals that he was there to get closure for himself, not mainly to give closure to Manuel. Or to put that a better way, trying to give closure to Manuel was just a way to try to trick himself into thinking that he's doing anything more than participate in meaningless violence. What he is to Manuel is a perpetrator of violence, and it's not significant here whether the truth is more complicated. When Manuel asked him if he was there when Nacho died, Mike admitted he was, with a very doctor giving bad news to a patient's family vibe and less of a doctor admitting to malpractice vibe, which is more how Manuel is feeling towards him.
You were there.
I was there.
Mike immediately went on to reassuringly tell Manuel that Nacho was a good guy but fell in with bad people, and a neutral-minded observer might notice how the conversation just conveniently shifted off of Mike being there when Nacho died. And that's when Mike went on to add that the Salamancas are going to be taken care of.
One more thing.
Of course, that was meaningless to Manuel, and let's be real, even if Gus is motivated by revenge towards the Salamancas for a variety of reasons, it also just happens to be extremely profitable for him as well. They are his main competitors, and he gobbles up their territory. He keeps Nacho as a spy as long as he does because it benefits him, financially and practically, but it's never just about that, and he would never let himself see it as just being about that. We know this explicitly from a line during his fateful final face-off with Lalo in the episode prior to this one with Manuel and Mike. When Gus is speaking into Lalo's camera at Lalo and the Salamancas in general, he says this.
Dicen que creen en sangre por sangre, pero solo entienden sangre por dinero.
I feel like it's so perfect for the themes of our video today that this whole monologue of Gus's here is double-sided. On the one hand, he's saying things he 100% believes, and on the other, it's completely just to stall as he gets ready to flip the lights off and shoot Lalo. Both things can be true at once, just like Chuck keeping Mesa Verde from Kim to punish her for trusting Jimmy, and also keeping Mesa Verde at HHM because they are a client and he's a lawyer at a firm. And just like Jimmy doing a slip and fall because the guitar store owners were unethical jerks and went back on their word, and also doing it to get rid of a $6,000 debt. In each case, you get the revenge side and the practical side. In some of these cases, like Chuck keeping Mesa Verde from Kim, what he did was understandable without the revenge aspect, which just makes it less understandable and more objectionable. With Jimmy in the guitar store, what he did would have been absolutely wrong and bizarre without the revenge side, just a scam on a local business because he made bad decisions and ended up in debt, but the revenge side makes it more understandable. Coming back to Gus, his whole campaign against the Salamancas would never be justified in his mind only on the basis of the money and power he gets from harming Hector. When he tells Lalo that he understands blood for blood, but they only understand blood for money, he's elaborating on what he said in his season 5 conversation with Mike in Mexico. In this scene, he got clearly offended when Mike equated Gus to the Salamancas.
And you are so very different from them?
Yes. I am different.
This scene and the episode it's in ends with Gus telling Mike that he wants Mike on his team because Mike understands that important thing we call
Revenge.
deep breath, and fade to black. I think Gus is manipulating Mike in this specific way because they both have the desire to feel like they're doing things for reasons beyond money. We see it many times in their relationship, including just a minute earlier when Mike started the exchange by directly saying,
I already told you what you can do with your money. You seem like a guy who can take a hint.
That's when Gus launches into manipulative stuff about how sad Mike's life trajectory is and how Mike can be the special big boy soldier in Gus's holy war. From this point on, we see Mike develop the same specific ability to lie to himself, leading to his conversation with Manuel and his line about their big important revenge against the Salamancas. Manuel brings us the down-to-earth perspective of, I'm not convinced. One more interesting thing about the Mexico scene with Gus and Mike is it shows Mike basically mocking Gus for donating all this money to soothe his conscience.
And is that supposed to balance the scales? Make up for everything else you do?
It makes up for nothing.
Gus seems to earn Mike's respect in this scene by admitting that no, it balances nothing. It's interesting that they can agree that doing good doesn't balance out doing bad, since isn't the revenge thing that they also agree on basically the idea that doing bad can balance out doing bad? I mean, it's sort of doing good when you're the one doing revenge, but still, it's the same idea, like you're balancing out doing bad with something else, whether you see it as bad or good. Why would murderers doing philanthropy be mockable while murderers executing vigilante justice is respectable? Because good can't make up for bad, but only bad can make up for bad? We'll talk about a situation in a bit where Mike clearly tries to do good to make amends for doing bad, so I definitely don't think it's cut and dry in their minds, I just think they're inconsistent. At the end of the day, as I've said before, I think Mike was unable to conceive of a life for himself that would be fulfilling enough without participating in dangerous activity, in the same way Jimmy was unable to conceive of a life for himself that would be fulfilling enough without participating in scams, swindling, and slipping. But Mike blinded himself with lies about deeper meaning because he lost the ability to confront who he really was and what he really was doing. At a certain point, if our reality around us gets bad, dangerous, and scary enough, even the best of us lose the ability to be honest with ourselves about what it is we're perceiving and why. We all have our limit where our truth can just be too overwhelming, so we lie to ourselves about this or that. Even Mike Ehrmantraut can get to the point where he's lying to himself using words like justice. Amazing. I like how in that line Gus says to Lalo, he says the Salamancas only care about blood for money. This takes into account that the blood for money aspect is obviously something he cares about as well, in addition to his interest in blood for blood transactions. And of course it doesn't have to be one or the other, but this does make me wonder if it's not one or the other, would Gus do it if there was no money he could gain? Would the revenge reason be enough? How would our feelings as the audience change if Gus was either completely motivated by revenge or was completely motivated by money? If you didn't already know, I am one of a small set of people who has done the unthinkable and watched Better Call Saul in full without seeing Breaking Bad at all.
You did what? Why? Why?
I know. I don't have any regrets about it though, gotta be honest. But it's come to my attention that there's a flashback in Breaking Bad to Hector killing Gus's partner Max in 1989, and so obviously this is the main source of this revenge motive for Gus. But I can tell you that watching Better Call Saul without knowing about this, it's honestly not like you miss out on all that much. I'm not just trying to be defensive, but think about it. We meet Gus in season 3, and one of the first things we see him do is talk with Mike about how he doesn't want Mike to kill Hector, but he wouldn't mind if Mike kept stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars from him. He tries to hire Mike, clearly wanting more and more help hurting Hector. And it's obviously not just a one-way thing, as we see Hector showing up and smoking a cigar at Los Pollos Hermanos, and Hector directing his guys to take an extra kilo. It's clear they have a history. The fact that Hector killed Gus's partner many years earlier adds helpful detail, but it doesn't feel like some huge revelation. It's just like how some people were wondering how I understood Marie in the last episode, and it's like, yeah, I didn't know anything about her, but I get that she's the widow of Hank and she's a victim of Jimmy's actions. I have a more superficial understanding of certain aspects for sure, and it's always helpful to know more, but it doesn't fundamentally change how I was already understanding the situation. I was never like, oh wait, why does Gus have this problem with Hector? Hector seems like such an easy guy to get along with. Knowing about Hector killing Max doesn't change that much because it was already clear that there was something justified in Gus's actions against Hector. Like at one point he says this,
A bullet to the head would have been far too humane.
And when he says that, even though you watch and know he himself is probably not a great guy, it's believable that he has good justification for feeling this way. The question is, how much does that justification justify? And do competing, less justified motivations extract from the justifiedness of the justified motivation, or do they just not add to it? Again, it's quite convenient that exacting revenge is extremely profitable for Gus. Meaning the revenge, the noble thing he thinks is better and more exalted, this happens to align perfectly with the contemptible animalistic greed he's so defensive about being compared to. I asked our Discord server if anyone could think of ways that Gus's actions against Hector in any way went against his financial interests, and friend of the channel System brought up the good point that Gus did spend a ton of money to get Hector that Johns Hopkins doctor to get him the best care possible, keep him alive, and bring him back to being himself. And Gus spends a lot on this in order to prolong Hector's suffering, so this in a way could be seen as Gus working against his financial interest in the cause of revenge.
The new wing is simply extraordinary.
There's no doubt that Gus was spooked by Nacho actually harming Hector and sort of like making Gus feel like, well, what if I don't even get the chance to, make this guy suffer? What if he dies before he realizes just how much I'm screwing him over? So Gus is definitely motivated by revenge. I'm not trying to say he's not, but there is that financial benefit too, and you wonder just like how much he would push against that. I mean, paying for a new wing might be nothing to Gus also. But anyways, Gus was obviously motivated by revenge, and he was ultimately trying to maximize suffering. These are not the same thing, but they're certainly related. Does Gus being motivated by revenge make what he does more justified? Does Nacho's death being in service of that revenge make it less tragic? I'd say no, because Nacho wasn't a subject of the revenge, he was just used as a tool in it. To contrast Gus's efforts, look at Nacho trying to kill Hector, but Nacho just wanted Hector dead. He didn't want to torture him or exact revenge, he just wanted to increase the chances that he could get out of the game with himself and his dad alive, and he figured killing Hector would be a good step in that direction. So it was a practical move, goal-directed rather than revenge-motivated. He didn't need a vengeance motive, his survival motive was already sufficiently justifying. Same thing with when he knocks out the lookout guy being paid to spy on him. It would be absurd to consider this revenge, since he just knocked the guy out, hurting him as little as possible while being able to escape. Nacho's consistently less driven by revenge. What else is Nacho supposed to do when Hector insists on bringing his dad into the game? Contrast this with Jimmy and Kim's actions against their old boss Howard. In their largely vengeful plans, the only practicality we can really find is the chance for a multi-million-dollar payoff from the Sandpiper case, and I think we can agree that their desire for that money was not on the same level as Nacho's need to protect himself and his dad. Similarly, Nacho seems to be someone who was in the game for the money, not for the power or sense of identity or anything like that. I mean, I'm sure it made him feel cool and stuff, but he didn't seem to need that for his view of himself like some other characters. He mostly just seems to want the money. Like when he shows up at Jimmy's office in season 1 to try to figure out how to rob the Kettlemans, he's just like, I know there's money there, I'm not just gonna leave that on the table. Same with when he robs Price. You can say Nacho was offended by the way Price and the Kettlemans did their work and he wanted to teach them a lesson, but that would be total speculation. It's interesting, Mike actually speculates this at one point.
Teach him a lesson, too.
But I think this is Mike's projection because he's more absorbed by resentment and animosity. Nacho seems more coldly calculating, less vengeful, less wanting other people suffering, and more wanting his own lack of suffering, wanting to be free. Because really, so many of Nacho's actions are compelled, not free, in the second half of this series and even earlier.
I've got no choice.
We can assume he was associating with Hector in the beginning by his own choice when we meet him in season 1, but he encounters unforeseen obstacles like Tuco's temperament and Hector's unwavering dedication to involving Nacho's dad, and he starts feeling like he has to make a lot of forced moves. Unfortunately, in trying to free himself from Hector, he in fact becomes fully under the control of Gus, and so many of his actions from then on are compelled at gunpoint on some level. Before the whole thing where he got shot in the desert by Gus's men, there's the awful situation that that started with him pulling a gun to get a 6th kilo from Gus's guys, and even this whole plan of taking the kilo was Arturo's idea, not Nacho's. And I will briefly note that Gus made Nacho watch Arturo die, like Hector made Gus watch Max die, so he seems to have learned more than just revenge from that experience. For Mike to act to Manuel like they're going to avenge Nacho's death by getting Hector Salamanca, it's absurd in part because Mike's boss is the guy most directly responsible for Nacho's death. Gus was the one putting Nacho in more and more dangerous situations. And while Hector first had the idea of bringing Nacho's dad into the game, Gus had his people explicitly threaten Manuel in front of him. No one watches this scene and thinks what's being done to Nacho is justified, because it's needless suffering regardless of the fact that it's in service of Gus's revenge. But think about this, what if Nacho was actually necessary for Gus's revenge, which isn't very far-fetched at all to imagine? If he was necessary to Gus's revenge, and we consider Gus's revenge necessary, then would Nacho's suffering be worthwhile? This is, I think, one of the problems with considering revenge obligatory or like part of your code of ethics. If Gus couldn't do his revenge without Nacho, but we don't think Nacho's suffering is worthwhile for Gus's revenge, then how important is revenge exactly? How much does it outweigh? If Nacho had been the one to kill Gus's partner, okay, I guess this and more would be fine, but see, what are we suggesting are the rules here? Gus is allowed to kill Hector, but not to put anyone else in harm's way in the process of doing so? Is that even possible? Shouldn't it matter whether it's possible? Shouldn't we work our philosophical and moral views around what's empirically and actually possible? So was Gus's revenge against Hector less justified than Mike's revenge against the cops, or did he just carry it out in a way that added unjustified elements on top of justified elements? At what point do these cancel out? Because all in all, it's hard to say just how much of Gus's behavior was justified by Hector having killed his partner Max. There's a chance I'll get a couple comments from people saying all of Gus's actions were justified no matter what the side effects, because he was hurting a violent, dangerous man like Hector. On the part 2 video, I got a bunch of the type of comments we briefly touched on earlier about how Mike killing the cops was good because he removed 2 corrupt cops from the world. I think this is a misguided use of a harm reduction mentality and completely misses the point regarding systemic issues. Hoffman and Fensky were not even a millionth of a drop in a millionth of the bucket of police corruption, and Mike knew it better than anyone. It would have been out of character at that time for him to rationalize his actions to himself in this way. Still, the more interesting point to me is why would these commenters use a harm reduction and consequence-focused rationalization if we truly believe that it was enough for Mike's revenge motive to be justified? Am I supposed to believe that the people who think Mike's actions were justified because he got 2 bad cops off the street are a completely distinct group from the people who think Mike's actions were justified because the cops killed his son? Of course not, because many more people would agree with the revenge motive compared to the harm reduction motive, I think, and this is evident in the fact that most people wouldn't want someone to single-handedly murder 2 people even if they knew those people to be corrupt police officers who had killed someone. I mean, some would disagree for sure, but these are just my speculations. We prefer for things to not be handled that way, but we forgive it when victimized individuals are exacting revenge. But even justified revenge can cause as many problems as it solves. As Manuel says,
It never ends.
So we have cognitive dissonance, knowing that revenge is justified, but also knowing that violence begets violence. And this causes us to look at other rationalizations for added support. But I think the hollowness of this consequentialist rationalization and the clear lack of applicability to Mike just shows our discomfort with fully relying on revenge as a motive. Obviously, avenging his son is a more solid reason than getting the cops off the streets, because harm that has already been done is more definite than potential harm. But at this point, we're just lucky, as far as our moral reasoning is concerned, that we're considering a case where the person exacting revenge is extremely capable at doing so effectively. There are so many cases where the collateral damage is much more significant, like with Gus's revenge against Hector. But we don't even need to look to another character to see a contrasting situation. We can look at the actions that took Mike down the whole road he went down to begin with, which were actions of revenge he himself took against Hector. The lead up to this was a bunch of situations where Mike wasn't acting on any revenge motive, but instead was just trying to make money. He worked with Price for money to support Stacy and Kaylee, and he worked with Nacho for money as well, accepting the extremely risky Tuco assignment for the money.
50 grand.
At this point in the show, Stacy feels unsafe in her home, and Mike immediately helps her move into a new home, so he's presumably under significant financial pressure. As a side note, people argue about this a lot online, but it seems to me the correct understanding is that Stacy's just extremely worried and stressed and probably has PTSD from losing her husband to being murdered, so she's maybe a little bit paranoid and worried that someone shot her house and might have imagined the bullet hole. It might have been a mark that was already there in the house. I don't think any of this should be surprising, and I think it's absurd that some people try to act like Stacy's lying consciously or something. But what I do think is very worth pointing out is that maybe she didn't actually need to move houses, right? Like maybe Mike, if he had been better about like understanding feelings and stuff, would have supported her emotionally and not just felt that he had to fully support her financially. Mike succeeds with the Tuco project, but it's a Pyrrhic victory as he suffers some significant blows, but his wounds are just the beginning of the consequences of his actions, as unsurprisingly getting Tuco Salamanca arrested puts him in a dangerous position and leads to a situation where it would now be even more justified for Stacy to feel unsafe. Mike gets out-wolfed and ends up having to do what Hector wants, telling the cops that Tuco's gun was his, though Mike does get some money for Stacy in the process.
Maybe I need the 50,000 more than you do.
Wow, Mike Ehrmantraut really said to each according to their needs. Good for him. Anyway, he financially supports Stacy and Kaylee moving out of their house, but the cousins threatened Kaylee directly, I'm sure we all remember, so Mike gets some feelings about that and things become about revenge. In fact, after the scene of Mike and Stacy where she gets a new house, the next thing we see of Mike is in the next episode we see him beginning to track the Salamanca crew. Then there's his great and cute scene with Kaylee where we see her wise comments that we talked about in part 4, and it's such a hilarious scene too because obviously their DIY home project is doubling as an instrument of Mike's revenge, as we see at the end of the episode and at the beginning of the next. But in that previous one where he starts following the Salamancas and plotting revenge, it's important to note that this is the same episode that Jimmy does the 1216, 1261 Mesa Verde sabotage. The show cuts from one to the other so intentionally that we literally go from seeing Mike in a car tracking the Salamanca operation to seeing Jimmy in a car going to Chuck's house where he would immediately decide to sabotage his brother. The show again has us considering two parallel paths of revenge, and here we see them both succeed in their aims, but their success comes with considerable unforeseen costs. Doing the hit on Hector's trafficking operation was very profitable, but equally importantly, it gave Mike the sense of gratification he was looking for. He even went on to spy on Hector to see his reaction to the news. Even just as viewers, we feel a little sweet tingle of justified revenge. How dare you threaten Kaylee? Then we see Mike celebrate at a bar, he's riding high, and we even see him soon have a flirtatious encounter.
You can shovel my drive if you're looking for more.
Just say the word.
Wow, I hope this video doesn't get age restricted now. Anyway, he brings that energy to the immediate next scene, which is of Nacho confronting him about the hit on Hector and the cartel operation. Mike makes it clear that he's acting from revenge.
I haven't forgotten him.
Nacho doesn't care about the hit money-wise, but becomes very angry at the lengths Mike is willing to go to when it becomes apparent Mike is trying to sick the cops on Hector as well. Nacho explicitly takes issue with Mike's revenge motive.
You put me in the shit just 'cause you got it in for Hector Salamanca?
That's a line that would have worked at many other times in the show too, especially with Gus. We see very clearly what we've been saying about the difference between Nacho and the more vengeance-oriented people.
Doing it for the money, I get it. But this shit, that's insane.
Mike doesn't respond to this, he responds instead to the fact that Nacho's put his hand on his gun, but I do wonder what Mike would say if he did respond to the point. Nacho's pointing out how Mike is willing to use him in the service of Mike's revenge, and Nacho's saying, hey, maybe I'm not a justified casualty of this, eh? But with where Mike's at this point, I think that when we're righteously angry about something, it's sort of like having our head in a cloud. We feel this rush from the sense of moral justification, but that can come with blinders. So Mike then gets hit hard by the revelation of the unforeseen consequences of his actions as Nacho tells him Hector murdered the Good Samaritan who stopped and helped the driver Mike left hogtied in the desert in the service of his revenge. This episode is called Nailed, and it also shows Jimmy experiencing the unforeseen consequences of his own revenge, as Chuck has the serious injury he suffers at the copy shop. Further quote-unquote unforeseen consequences for Jimmy are actually fake and manufactured by Chuck, as Chuck pretends to doubt his mental faculties so much that he feels he has to quit HHM. This level of consequences was too much for Jimmy, so he tries to make amends by admitting to Chuck what he did. I mean, it's not really making amends, obviously, because he says like it's your word against mine, and he's just telling the bare minimum to try to make it so the consequences of his actions are minimized. So it's not really amends, but it's the best he can do at that time. Mike, on the other hand, starts feeling like he needs to make up for the death of the innocent Good Samaritan. It had been possible for Mike to justify hog-tying the driver for his revenge, since after all, the guy worked for the cartel, I guess, but Mike is not able to block out the unnecessary death of an innocent, helpful person who stopped to help. So Mike's style of making up for this is to immediately set out to murder Hector. It's honestly kind of sad rewatching this. Like, I don't get the juicy action feel. I get this strange feeling of, wow, this is a grown man and he really can't stop himself from creating more problems. Many people would not immediately try to kill Hector in this situation, regardless of the fact that it's justified. The process of him exacting revenge on Hector gets him involved with Gus. If he had dealt with knowledge of the Good Samaritan's death in a way other than trying to kill Hector, I honestly wonder if he would still have linked up with Gus in the same way. His vigilante execution attempt sort of endears him to Fring on some level, and we can read the note Gus left him in the voice, "Don't." They're a very cute couple and they have a lot in common.
However, I am not completely unsympathetic to your sense of justice.
They come to an agreement that there's more they can do to get Hector, since Gus would like Hector to suffer and Mike hasn't gotten the fulfillment he feels he requires ever since learning about Hector killing the Good Samaritan. I wonder if Mike would have gone to the same lengths if Nacho hadn't mentioned that Hector himself killed the Samaritan. It really let Mike lick his vengeance chops over the specific target. So then he goes on and ingeniously plants drugs on another cartel truck, which gets them in trouble because drugs are illegal. In the next episode, Mike refuses payment from Gus because he did what he did for himself, not for Gus.
I'm just glad to have Salamanca out of my head.
This is the last we see of Mike for a bit, as the episode ends and the next one is Chicanery, which has no Mike at all, and we see him next in the following episode with Stacy at a group therapy meeting at her church. Then we see him with the church group in the following episode, having a very chill, sort of flirty, cement-based interaction.
Like this?
He seems to sort of reach a place of peace temporarily at this part in the show, so much that he even finds a genuine way to make amends for the Good Samaritan's death, like a non-revenge way, and does the most he can really do, which is track down the dead body of the Good Samaritan and call it into the police so their family and friends can at least have that element of closure. We then see him meet with Fring to find a way to clean his money so he can leave it to his family. This scene reverses their sort of inside joke in their friendship where they offer each other a lot of money for something illegal and then the other one turns down the money but still does the illegal thing. It's a very cute bit that brings them together.
I would not take money from your family.
Then he just silently stands up and they shake hands. Like, Gus is so weird sometimes. This conversation leads to the Madrigal money laundering situation, of course, and Mike has one scene there at the beginning of the next episode and then does not appear on screen for the final 90-ish minutes of season 3. Mike just has nothing to do, and as the 4th season starts, we see him quit his job at the booth, help out Stacy and Kaylee, and start imposing himself usefully on the Madrigal Corporation because he's so bored and feels so useless. But he finds a pretty healthy outlet for that with the Madrigal pro bono work, and is even in such a healthy place that he declines when Jimmy soon pitches him on the idea of stealing those little dolls from the office that committed the unforgivable sin of offering Jimmy a job. Mike asks about the details of Jimmy's motivations.
Guys in the office cross you?
This question is clearly asking whether Jimmy is motivated by revenge, and Jimmy defends himself by clarifying in response,
You're missing the point. It's free money.
Mike is in a great place now, and he can see how Jimmy is lying to himself. He can tell it's a revenge motive, and that doesn't make him any more interested. He recommends Jimmy not do this scam, and then out of nowhere gives his condolences about Chuck's passing, which gets predictably minimal recognition, if any at all. Mike's healthy phase comes to an abrupt halt in the next episode titled Talk, which shows him have another group therapy session, and this one goes awry when Mike reacts strongly to Stacy sharing feelings of guilt about an experience of temporary not feeling grief.
Hadn't thought about Maddie all morning.
The feelings this creates for Mike cause him to erupt, and I'm definitely understanding of where he's coming from here. It's okay to be emotional sometimes, but it's still really significant that he has such a big reaction. She's expressing guilt already, first of all, plus she didn't do anything wrong. It was one morning. It's a sign, of course, of Mike's own struggles with acceptance that he has such an intense reaction to this. When he eventually apologizes to Stacy about this, he tells her that of course no one expects her to constantly grieve, and she immediately turns this around back at him.
Same goes for you.
I think it's safe to say that remembering something all the time can be as difficult as forgetting something all the time, and because Mike struggles to find a healthy balance, he sees this in black and white until reflecting on his outburst. Better Call Saul has this theme going through it all throughout, this idea of how do we move on? How do we move on from an injustice, from a perceived injustice, from things not going our way, from someone hurting us, or even just how do we move on from the consequences of our own actions? What do we do, and what is it like for us to experience the consequences of what we choose to do? After Jimmy and Mike's traumatic experiences in the desert, for instance, Jimmy expresses exasperation to Mike, and they have a conversation directly in line with these themes. We already talked in part 2 about how Mike gives Jimmy a piece of advice that Jimmy later repeats in a confused and misguided way to Kim.
We all make our choices.
Look, we all make choices, right?
We talked about how he twists that advice to be from about accepting the consequences of your choices to instead just being about choices leading to consequences, which he says in this weird way to try to convince Kim she's made a mistake by quitting the Schweikart firm. But what I've been itching to mention for a while is that there was a whole separate piece of advice Mike gave Jimmy that Jimmy twisted in a similar way. So let's look at that as it relates even more to this idea of moving on. This is a season and a half after Mike's blow up at group therapy, of course, and he's long since made progress in the acceptance category. He gets a good chance to demonstrate this as their conversation in his car starts with Jimmy asking,
You said this goes away, so what's the time frame on that?
Mike seems very ready for this type of question. He starts by saying,
One day you're gonna wake up, eat your breakfast, brush your teeth, go about your business.
He really learned something positive from the group therapy experience, or the whole situation related to it. I don't know. I'm not just trying to promote therapy. I am a therapist, by the way, if you didn't know that. But Mike definitely learned something somewhere. I don't know where, but he learned that Stacy's experience was normal and it's natural to sometimes forget. That could mean the inevitability of temporarily forgetting about a lost loved one, or it could mean temporarily forgetting about a traumatically stressful experience.
You're gonna realize you haven't thought about it. None of it.
After walking Jimmy through this a bit, or I guess Saul, I don't really know. I mean, what does Mike call him? I honestly don't know. But after walking him through this sort of understanding, he goes on to say more.
You realize you can forget. When you know that's possible, it all gets easier.
But Mike's style of self-care doesn't really work for Jimmy. He asks whether Mike was bothered by what happened in the desert, and Mike says it was them or us. Jimmy wants to believe it, but can't fully convince himself. Still, he internalizes Mike's words to a serious degree. Fast forward one full season, and Jimmy and Kim's last episode as a couple starts with almost exactly 6 minutes of no dialogue, and then comes Jimmy sitting on the bed, not even making eye contact with Kim, and trying to give his own sage wisdom about moving on. In this case, about how they will move on from witnessing and very arguably being responsible for Howard's death.
One day we'll wake up and brush our teeth and we'll go to work.
He goes on to say how on this day, one day in the future, they'll realize,
No, we haven't thought about it at all. None of it.
Is this starting to sound familiar? It's supposed to, of course. It's almost word for word the same, with him even mentioning brushing teeth, just like Mike did, and just morphing a few other words. He goes on to say that when this happens, and when they realize that they didn't think of the traumatic event,
We'll know we can forget.
B- for plagiarism and poor execution. When he says this to Kim, it feels to me like he's referring to moving on from the sense of guilt, rather than moving on from the traumatic stress of witnessing a murder. His whole overly simple, reassuring voice and his distant, disconnected body language, it just seems like he's trying to convince himself they didn't do anything wrong, rather than actually knowing how to connect with Kim's feelings. It's not at all clear that she asked him anything, actually. If you're not convinced by my vague feeling, let me give you this additional example example of him giving the same advice, transformed in the same way, now even more blatantly, when he argued to Buddy and Jeff that robbing the cancer patient they drugged is something that won't bother them for too long. By this point, years later, he's lost most of the pieces of this advice and just has a vacant shell of it that he squeezes now into barely a sentence or two.
You get over it, okay? Please, believe me. Before you know it, you forget all about it.
He's literally just like, what, guilt? Nah, don't worry about guilt. That's no big deal. This is a sequence that really shows how low Gene's moral reasoning has stooped, and it's very much in line with the trajectory he'd been on for years. Back at the end of season 5, before things fully went off the deep end, Kim and Jimmy's hotel conversations already revealed how deprived their moral reasoning skills were.
A career setback for one lawyer.
And while Jimmy is definitely not on board in this scene, I mean, he does do it. He goes along with it eventually. Only takes a bit of time and barely any nudging from Kim.
You sure? Well, what's the harm in listening?
They were eventually unable to rule out humiliating and drugging their old boss from being a means they considered justifiable for their ends, and they were able to believe that their ends and their intentions were good enough. The ultimately fatal Howard plan is very full circle for Better Call Saul. From the relatively harmless trolling billboard revenge against Howard to the full-on drugging and humiliating sabotage revenge against him. Oh wow, I just had the thought, I wonder if some people are watching this show thinking that it would have been fine as long as Lalo never killed Howard. And if you think that, I just think you're missing this larger point about unintended consequences of our actions. I'm not quite sure how comfortable Kim and Jimmy are admitting it to themselves, but they both had substantially justified animosity and resentment towards Howard. But, you know, that's life, right? I mean, he wasn't deserving of having his career damaged by them. Not his whole professional reputation, at least. So to themselves, they focused on the fact that they were helping the Sandpiper clients, or getting themselves a bunch of money, or they just enjoyed the wild ride of the excitement. It's just interesting how we appeal to moral justifications in a pretty opportunistic way. When it's convenient for us, we used a moral justification, and when it's inconvenient, we used a practical justification. It's inconvenient to Gus's self-image that he murders people for money and power, so he focuses on murdering them as a part of a long, drawn-out righteous plan of revenge. On the other hand, it's inconvenient to Jimmy to use the revenge motive when he does the 1216-1261 sabotage to Chuck's professional reputation, so he says he did it to help Kim. While he does mention animosity towards Chuck and Howard, it's brought up as a runner-up reason.
She worked her butt off to get Mesa Verde while you and Howard sat around sipping scotch and chortling.
Similarly, it's inconvenient to Chuck's sense of self to consider his decision to fight to keep Mesa Verde at HHM as a decision motivated by revenge and animosity, so he says,
I didn't swipe anything. We retained our client.
The practical motive is the justification here because the revenge motive doesn't add any justification. The whole chicanery situation was a further elaboration of this pattern, as Jimmy only gets a 1-year suspension of his law license because of the fact that Chuck's legendary monologue showed his animosity and resentment so well that it overshadowed the credibility and justifiability of his accusations. His explosion on the stand made it clear he was primarily motivated by revenge, even if there were other motivations mixed in. And this damaged his case against Jimmy, of course, and damaged himself, professionally and personally. Was that Jimmy's revenge for Chuck's revenge for Jimmy's revenge for Chuck's revenge? And did one of them start the revenge, or no? These behaviors can genuinely be seen both as revenge and not as revenge at the same time. I mean, if we can believe Jimmy, he explicitly says he did the 1216-1261 sabotage because 1, Kim earned the client, 2, Kim needs the client, and 3, he didn't think it would hurt Chuck so much. So there's zero revenge motive admitted to by him here, but I don't believe he's self-aware enough and or motivated enough here to be honest about the animosity or at least neglect that drove him to sabotage his brother as soon as he realized he was unresponsive. Just because he can rely on practical motives here doesn't dictate that we need to believe him. Because if we thought that way, then what Chuck did by keeping Mesa Verde was not revenge either, because he had a practical excuse.
We retained our client.
Notice him phrasing it this way is focusing on the future future-oriented aspect of his behavior, what he was hoping to cause by his actions. Same with when Jimmy says Kim needed Mesa Verde as a client, though Jimmy does go into past-focused justifications by saying Kim earned the client and the stuff about Howard and Chuck chortling. Jimmy is forced into a position where he has to be much more honest about his justifications because he's been caught doing something objectively far worse than what Chuck did here. Immediately after he does the sabotage, he's there as Chuck wakes up, and the way Jimmy argues with him from the moment he wakes up lends itself to the resentment and revenge side being prominent in him at that time. This scene specifically ends with Chuck declining an argument with Jimmy and instead getting as close as he gets to intimacy and connection.
Thanks for staying with me. I know we have our issues.
With the irony, of course, that we know what Jimmy's been up to in the meantime. He very much was not putting their issues aside, unless you consider flagrantly disregarding Chuck completely as putting their issues aside. When he admits to Chuck what he did, he tells him he just expected Chuck to carry on with life.
Like a normal person!
And one funny thing is that while Chuck was obviously rattled by the whole experience and made to question his own cognitive ability, that really doesn't actually last very long. Jimmy is sort of wrong to imply that Chuck just couldn't move on from this one small setback, because the only thing keeping him from moving on is the fact that he almost immediately realizes that Jimmy must have done it, and so he devotes himself to this elaborate plan to entrap his brother. I think it's way more unreasonable to expect Chuck to see the good intentions in Jimmy's document sabotage than it is to expect Jimmy to see good intentions, or at least lack of bad intentions, in Chuck keeping Mesa Verde at HHM. It's totally fair to be upset with Chuck for doing it because he was dealing with his EHS and he could have just not gone into the office, but he wanted to go in. And it's less overtly sabotage. If you don't realize that, I'm going to assume you don't work in a profession where you have clients, because what Chuck did was entirely reasonable in the circumstances on the face of it. To be clear, I think what Chuck did was also targeted directly at Jimmy, or maybe Kim or Jimmy, it's hard to say, but Chuck was trying to punish Kim for trusting Jimmy. However, Chuck's unjustified harmful intentions were a lot better disguised than Jimmy's were with the number switching stuff, because Chuck's behavior at least appeared innocent from the outside. His means and end were both acceptable, while just his intention was bad. Contrast this with Jimmy doing the number switching, and I guess his end was acceptable if we just believe him about getting Kim the client. So in a limited way, I guess, but his means were condemnable, and even if we say his intention was good. I would argue intentions are less important than both the means and the ends of our behaviors, because the means and the ends are what most directly affects others. I still think intentions are relevant and sometimes important, but they're more likely to be worth disregarding, I think, compared to the means and ends of our actions. It's so interesting. As I say this, I confuse myself, because the ends is part of our intention, but we also have a lot that motivates us that it wouldn't even be clear to call it an intention. Does long-standing resentment between the two brothers count as part of their intention, or is that part of their motivation? Are those different? And then this isn't really the same as the ends, but there's also the unconsidered consequences, things that were either ignored or neglected. This is things like when I brought up the kids of Hoffman and Fensky. And look, I understand if people aren't moved by this argument about the kids of the cops. You might be thinking, tough shit, sorry your dad was a murderer, not my fault. I also understand if people aren't fully convinced by thoughts of Stacy or Kaylee's perspective, especially because we don't even know what their perspective was. It's just potential that they disagreed. But even if people say, okay, what Maddie would have wanted, yeah, that's important, it matters, but it doesn't override Mike's justification to exact revenge, regardless of the consequences. And sure, in a sense, Mike's revenge against those cops was very clean and had few overtly negative side effects, unless you count it leading to Mike moving to Albuquerque and going down the whole road he does, but Stacy already lived there, so maybe he would have moved there anyway. However, the point I've tried to make is that such a clean act of revenge is just one piece of the moral tapestry Better Call Saul weaves for us. On a different note, sometimes Better Call Saul shows us examples of revenge that are just purely good and badass. Like when Howard embarrasses and condescends to Kim while she's out at lunch, so she immediately pays him back $14,000 for her tuition payments. That would be like half a semester nowadays. This is a trolling and harmless form of revenge, so vastly more self-liberating than self-dooming, assuming she has that money in the bank, I guess. It reminds me of a book I read this past year, Debt, by David Graeber, which is a great anthropological history of debt, where at one point Graeber talks about how canceling a debt can be a symbol of cutting a social tie. The way you might pay for a pizza for your friends and then have someone else pay for the next one instead of calculating everyone's share and staying even each time, which almost implies you're not going to see each other again. Howard takes Kim paying him back the way she meant it, which was as an insult, a statement that she doesn't need him, they're square and they don't need to ever talk again, basically. This is all coming a few episodes after the chicanery hearing when Kim cross-examined him about Chuck and overall took Jimmy's side through his sabotage campaign against Chuck and HHM, which he admitted to on tape that was played for the record. If only Kim and Howard had just, hated each other forever. Oh well, if it had been any different, it wouldn't have been the best show on television. It's about time we finish up today and finish talking about Better Call Saul once and for Saul, besides the little bonus video, of course, from members and patrons, and besides a video in like a year or something about price. But one last thing. I said much earlier in this video that we would come back to the question of whether Jimmy getting his license suspended was Chuck's revenge for Jimmy switching the numbers on the Mesa Verde documents. And I guess we sort of already covered that Chuck obviously has animosity and resentment towards Jimmy, which motivates a lot of his behavior. He's just good at giving himself plausible deniability, like Jimmy is about what his motives are. But it has to be said, and I meant to make this point earlier, but still, Jimmy obviously deserved to face professional consequences for falsifying the documents of another lawyer, regardless of what his motivations or goals were. And when I say deserve, what I mean is I want to live in a world where people face professional consequences for doing something like that. I'm a therapist. If I violate the ethics of my profession by breaking confidentiality with a client or doing something else, I deserve to face professional consequences. That's the world I want to live in, where people have consequences for their actions. If we consider someone holding someone else accountable for their actions something worthy of being taken revenge against, then we're just going to be constantly, in this world where people are fighting with each other, which is obviously the world we live in, but I think the goal is to minimize that. As the viewer, we don't like that Chuck wants to control Jimmy, but we also feel like, hey, who is going to control this Jimmy guy? He really is like a chimp with a machine gun. That's not a bad metaphor, even if I wouldn't use it against my sibling. Okay, well, wow. What a great journey this has been, spending the last year making 8 long-form video essays about Better Call Saul. If I had a time machine, I'd do it all over again. I've had a great time writing and producing all these videos, and I'm so glad I've built a bit of an audience here on YouTube in the process. I've had a lot of fun hanging out at our live streams, and I plan to do another one in a few days after this video comes out, and probably every month or so, periodically. I also stream on Twitch all the time, but I'll save some of this for the outro. I hope you all enjoyed this video today. Please check out the other ones if you'd like to, as well as the side channel, the rock stacking channel, and, go ahead and subscribe if you want, because there's going to be a lot of things in the future, even if it's not going to all be about Better Call Saul. It's really hard to conclude a project as big as this video series, I gotta say. I've said so much, but what if I have more to say? Well, there's always the Breaking Bad video I gotta do sometime. I thought a nice cathartic way to close this out would be for me to ask some second opinions. Am I doing the right thing by ending this series?
You're doing the right thing.
Okay, well, Jimmy, you're just kind of nice. What about you, Hector? What do you think of my decision?
I approve this.
Thanks. Wow, I appreciate that. Mike, what do you think? I've sort of covered pretty much everything that needs to be covered, right?
Not enough.
Oh, Mike, you just want me to talk all day, don't you? Well, I guess it's 2 against 1 so far. Lalo, what do you think?
Te vas a morir.
Okay, I do not appreciate that at all, and we're not counting that towards the vote. All right, Stacy, I feel like we should take your thoughts into account too here.
He left me quite the mess.
Okay, that does not seem totally fair, and I don't know what you think I did. I mean, I just made some videos, and that doesn't count as a vote either. All right, Kim, I know I can rely on you. What do you think?
You made a mistake.
What, like in doing this whole series? All right, well, okay, last one to break the tie. I need to ask you, Gus, what do you think I should do here?
Why do you ask?
Okay, I guess you're just giving me the diplomatic response. Well, I think the best outcome for everybody would be this video ending now. So let's bring it to a close with this whole series coming to a close, and I want to thank you for watching and or presumably listening. Now, see you in the outro. Whoa, hello! Wow, the last outro. What a good time. First time recording an outro at night. First time having a beer during an outro. I believe it's been iced coffee each time. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. You must be an extremely curious, intelligent, wise, kind, gentle person. If you want to be, or if you want to be a different kind of person, that's fine too. If you'd like to support this channel and these videos and you have some disposable income, you can do that. I actually will allow you to give me money, believe it or not. You can do that via YouTube by becoming a member for, I believe, $3 a month, and you can stop at any time. Or you could join via patreon.com, where I have a page there. I also do offer extra stuff for supporters on YouTube and on Patreon. As I mentioned in this video, there's a bonus video right now, live. Go become a YouTube member or go to Patreon. You'll see it, I swear, it's there. I'm gonna make sure of that. Yeah, see, the camera just glitched. So if you do give me money, eventually I'll buy a camera that isn't my cell phone, even though I got this cell phone for the camera, but it glitches all the time. And like, they don't tell you about that stuff when you're in the store. They're just like, oh, like 4K, bro. Anyways, I now want to thank all the great people who do actually support these videos. So first up, thank you to the Patreon supporters. Thank you so much, User. Thank you so much, Elise. Thank you, Joe N. Thank you, Strawman Productions. Thank you, Miles. Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Thulusaurus Rex. Thank you, Gunther. Thank you, Modest Maoist. Thank you, Isaiah. Thank you, Ariamon. Thank you, Scott M. Thank you, Joe M. I don't know if you know each other. You should talk to Scott. Maybe you're from the same M family. Thank you, Luca. Thank you, Scott S. Thank you, Amir. Thank you, Isaac. Thank you, Jack. Thank you, Ashley. Thank you, Wacky Jim. Thank you, Bennett. And thank you, Chained Coffin. I assume that's not your full name, so I can just say it. Okay, over to the YouTube members. Thank you, Jaden. Thank you, Daisy Girl. Thank you, Simply Snaps, who you may all remember I had a great chat with in one of the live streams, which is on the side channel available with the other YouTube live streams. So thank you, Simply Snaps. Thank you, Nix. Thank you, Isaiah. Thank you, 39% Weird. That's a pretty good percentage. Thank you, Bastian. Thank you, Gift Sparks. And thank you, Pit Inhabitant. You all are great people, and I really appreciate the support. So like I said, this is the end of the Better Call Saul series on this channel. One day I will do a video about Price. I have a lot to say about him. He's an extremely awesome character. And like I said, there is a bonus video with a bunch of extra thoughts for YouTube members and Patreon supporters right now available. But this is basically the end. I mean, I think 8 videos is enough, and I think I said so much more than I ever could have dreamed of back in January when I got sick and was like rewatching Better Call Saul. So I'm extremely happy and proud that I got my thoughts out so much. I mean, expressing yourself is a really beautiful thing, and I'm so glad that I gave myself the time and space to really dig into everything I thought. You know, some of the things I talked about for 10 minutes in this video was just like a passing thought when I first watched the show. But when you dig into it and you explore it, there's a lot there. And you know, who knows? Like, it's interesting, right? Why not dig into it and delve into it and other D words, I don't know, dive into it? Could be good. Wow. I just had like a 30+ minute break because my phone glitched out worse than it's ever done when I'm filming. Like, I've filmed for like 12, 14 minutes nonstop on this phone, and then it'll overheat at more than that. But now it's not even overheating. It was literally just glitching. I couldn't even start it. So I think I'm taking it as a metaphor in the way that Better Call Saul in the last 3 episodes, I believe, the intro theme itself was deconstructed. You literally saw the theme of the show, which was already so cool in its abruptness, like the theme of Better Call Saul. And then the way it ends so abruptly, it was already so interesting, but then they chose to deconstruct it in those last 3 episodes and make it end earlier and be even more abrupt and be even more shocking. And it was so cool. I've never seen a show do that before. So I think my camera, I think I'm actually coming in on not even the right number of frames. I don't even know if my camera's working right now. I could have to redo this. it's possible, if not likely. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the future. You can catch me at the live stream in a few days on the YouTube channel. I'm gonna do a live stream. I have a lot of things to talk about. You can check me out on Twitch, where I live stream weekly, and check out the videos that will come in the future. This channel is not stopping at all. It's just the Better Call Saul series that's stopping. We have big plans, all kinds of different things to explore. We have all kinds of questions to ask. Wow, there's a bug crawling on the side of my phone, literally crawling around the camera. As I'm trying to finish these last moments, and my computer is on low battery. It's about to die. What is happening? I think I need to end this, okay? I hope this works, and I'll see you soon. Yeah, I guess, you know, we learned a lot about Better Call Saul. I think we learned it's the best show on television. Yeah.